get going. So we are here, sorry about that. We're here today. This is Talking More Than Turkey. This is our science storytelling webinar. My name is Shane Hanlon. I will, for all intents and purposes, be moderating, basically just taking questions at the end and doing some introductions in the beginning. We could talk a little bit more about AGU and the Sharing Science program later, but we kind of just want to get into it. So I'm going to introduce SueEllen Campbell and John Calderazzo. And so John and SueEllen, you can take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Shane. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Yeah, hi, everybody.
So a couple words about me. For 40 years, I've been a teacher and a writer of nonfiction. The last 30 of these have been at Colorado State University, where I just retired. And during that time, I've written a lot of magazine articles and a few books on natural world, often on science and other subjects. And I teach my students to do the same thing. In the last 10 years or so, I've gotten really interested in taking the storytelling skills that I have in my world and bringing them to the world of science so that people like you can share better with the public and with decision makers the really exciting stuff that you do and have those discoveries move faster into the public realm than might otherwise be the case. That really turns me on.
So I'm SueEllen Campbell. I'm also a teacher and writer, have been for over 40 years. My specialty was the literature of nature and environment. And what's always especially interested me is bringing together information from the sciences with some of the elements of ordinary life, culture, emotion, sensory experiences, things like that. As an English professor, I've also been really interested in communication. And I would say my special thing there, unlike John's focus on storytelling, has been helping folks be clear, lively, and personable in their communication. About 10 years ago, John and I together formed an outfit, an initiative called Changing Climates at CSU, in which we worked with people from all over campus, from a whole lot of different disciplines, and also especially with a group of climate modelers in the atmospheric science department on understanding climate change from a lot of different perspectives and helping non-specialists understand a lot of what specialists know, but of course through translation. We started by running a lot of lectures, and John and I found ourselves coaching the speakers in helping them feel more comfortable talking to people from clear across campus. So the atmospheric scientists, we would say, imagine you're talking to a group of art students, and help them do that. I also run a website. I should switch slides here. I run a website called 100 Views of Climate Change that aims to present information from a lot of different perspectives that's all really accessible, again, to non-specialists. And as part of that, back up one.
Little lag time.
Yeah, sorry about the slides. Nope, back up. Maybe one more. Anyway, as part of all of this, we have run over the years quite a few workshops, a little bit like this one, though up until now always in person with other people. So that's where we're coming from. What we're going to do today is focus on the upcoming holiday season. So let me get to the right slide here. That's a picture of us is taken in the summertime, but we are actually also married to each other, and we're sitting at our kitchen table right now talking into the speakerphone. So our focus today is on some of the opportunities that the holiday season might present to you to practice talking about science, your science or other science that you know about. Depending on what kind of gatherings you're going to be involved in, whether they're mostly friendly people or whether they involve a lot of hostile people, you may find that this is one of the easiest places to practice. If you can do this, then it's a really good shot at doing other kinds of communication. Or you may find that it's harder to do it here because you're more personally involved, in which case if you can do it here, you can do it anywhere. So for both of those reasons, We are going to propose to you a set of scenarios. We have narrowed ourselves down to 6 scenarios that you might find yourself in, something like that, over the next 6 weeks or so. And we think that these are really useful for several reasons we're going to talk about here. So one is the basic stuff that's on the slide here. You will know the folks that you're talking to. You may not actually know them, but you know somebody who knows them. It's a friendly, kind of congenial situation. You can ask questions. They're real conversations, quite unlike, say, a job interview or a paper presentation or what we're doing right now where we can't see you. And you will, generally speaking, be in a civil framework. Of course, all the circumstances will be different, and your responses need to be different as well. But they're still, we think, really useful laboratories for imagining things.
And if you're not going anywhere this Thanksgiving, just think about some time, maybe in the near future, when you will be with a group of people who are not all in the exact same area that you are. In other words, you're talking across not only disciplines, but across levels of knowledge.
Right.
So a couple things to keep in mind. In general, communicating your science is not at all the same as doing your science. You've already done your science, or you're doing your science now. But to communicate it, it involves different skills, and those are the ones we're going to talk about here. And then as we go through this, we'd like you to think about your own work right now. Just take a moment and think about what you're most excited about, or what you'd most like to tell other people about it. And go from your passions. So think about that for a moment. And now let's go to the first scenario.
Okay, so this is our first scenario. If we only had time for one, this is probably what it would be. A bright 12-year-old asks you what you do. So imagine that you're sitting at a large table of people at Thanksgiving, and you're sitting next to a 12-year-old kid who maybe reminds you a little bit of yourself at that age, or a sibling or a friend at that age. And you know this kid is bright. The kid is obviously interested in what you do and is asking, but he or she is just 12 years old, and so isn't going to have the vocabulary that you might be used to using, is not probably going to know some of the really basic knowledge that you work from. It might feel basic to you. You might think you always knew it. You were born knowing it, but in fact you learned it maybe when you were 13 or 14, or maybe when you were 20. And it's a chance also, so it's a chance to practice talking about what you do without running into problems of communication of those two kinds. It's also a really good way to imagine yourself being interesting in your response, paying attention to what kinds of details or information might interest your actual audience, a 12-year-old kid, or that you think might be really important for that kid to hear. And also it's a chance to have fun. You might use the opportunity to crack jokes, or to do sound effects, or act something out with your body, or sculpt devil's tower in your mashed potatoes. And it's a good place to tell stories, which we'll be talking about a little bit more later.
Yeah, so for example, let's say for a minute you were a medical doctor, and you saw this same 12-year-old taking off on her bike, without a helmet on. Would you say, oh boy, hang on a minute, you better not do that because you might get a subdural hematoma? No, you wouldn't say that. You'd say, hey, put a helmet on, otherwise you're going to crack your head. In other words, you would immediately use the appropriate kind of language and not the technical stuff. So the same thing goes, right, with your science communication. If you think this sounds too primitive or too simplistic, keep in mind that some of the best science writers in the country use this very idea when they're talking to world experts in science. I have a friend named John Loma. I've known him for about 30 years. He writes biology occasionally for the New York Times science section. The audience there is a well-educated but very varied audience of millions. And sometimes he has to try to convey what a world expert in a certain area is doing. He told me that often on the phone, when things get too technical, or when the scientist has trouble explaining what he's doing or what he's doing, he says, hey, wait a minute. Imagine you're at a dinner party and a bright 12-year-old asks you what you do. Tell her. And suddenly on the phone, their voice changes. The way they think about things changes. They're not dumbing it down. They're simplifying it up, you might say, clarifying it up. So these things can really work, and you can have a lot of fun with them.
Yeah, John has told us that somebody will be talking in a kind of a stiff lecture-y and maybe too technical mode, and he'll ask this question, and the person will stop, and there will be a moment of silence, and then the voice will come back on the phone saying, "Oh, okay, well," and then start off on something really lively and really clear.
And this reminds me of one other thing before we go to the next scenario, which is anytime you're talking to, let's say, a member of the public, and not your dissertation committee, you don't necessarily, probably, in fact, you shouldn't start with your title or the title of the organization that you work for. Try instead to start with a brief description of what you do and why it matters. And that other stuff can come in later if there's time and it seems appropriate.
Right, this is all part of what's interesting to the person who is listening to you right at the moment. The 12-year-old is not going to care what your rank is, for example. So you don't need to lead with that. Okay, our second scenario, which we think is maybe the most likely scenario that everybody will encounter, is that something comes up in general conversation at a gathering that has been in the news, say within the last year or the last couple of months. There are just endless possibilities for how this might happen. Something may be directly relevant to your own work, or it may just be something that you have a slightly different perspective on, or some information about that everybody else at the table might not have because of your position as a scientist. And so you want to chime into the conversation. It's a good opportunity for you to do this. So the short list would start probably with hurricanes and floods and wildfires, and then immediately go to things like tree beetles, bark beetles, and drought, and sea level rise, and electric networks, and solar power versus conventional power. And it's just sort of, the topics can expand almost endlessly from things that have been in the news, even including political or semi-political things. Somebody might say, well, what do you think about what's happening in the EPA these days? And you would be able to chime in there.
This also gives you a chance to talk about shared values. You know, when you want to connect with an audience, if you have something shared values, we all care about kids, or we all care about clean air. You both have that going for you, and that's an advantage with communication. So this scenario has some built-in advantages for you. And it's a great opportunity to talk about how science affects our everyday life. So, for example, I saw something a couple days ago about how awful the air was in China and also, I think, in India.
It's terrible in India.
Yeah, and that reminded me that about a year ago, I heard an atmospheric chemist at CSU talking to faculty across the university. So he's talking to economists and historians and so forth. Everybody's smart and well-educated, but not in his area. How did he start? He stood in front of the room, and he asked all of us to with him, take one deep, long breath. He said, okay, let's do it. And so we did it. Breathe in, out. And then he said, the air you just breathed here in Fort Collins is about 100 times cleaner than the air that I grew up with in Bangalore, India. My job, my mission in life is to make sure that that air gets cleaner and that the air in other places doesn't get as dirty as that. Now you notice he didn't start with an equation, he didn't start with his title or anything like that. He came up with something that we all knew about, it had been in the news, and we all share, of course, an interest in clean air.
Right. So our third one, which is a wide open opportunity for you, our third scenario, is conversations just occurring, maybe with one person, maybe a whole table full of people, and somebody asks something really generic, like, have you got anything interesting coming up, or what's next for you? And let's make a couple of suppositions here. One is, let's say you don't want to really say what's coming up next with you because you're anxious about what you're going to do when you finish your degree. You don't have to answer that. You can answer something else. So let's talk a little bit about one possible option, since this is an AGU webinar. Maybe you're actually going to go to the meeting in New Orleans, and you know you're going to be giving a paper, or you know you're going to be giving a poster, but you've got audience there who doesn't really know what AGU is, doesn't really know what giving a paper is like, doesn't really know what it's like to present a poster. It's a really good opportunity for you to practice saying in ordinary, accessible, friendly, and so what kind of language, that you're giving a paper about what, and you're giving a poster, you're presenting a poster about what. Good practice for actually doing it.
And why does it matter? And why does it matter?
Yes. So it's an opportunity to practice being clear and focusing on what matters that's not super technical. Something that you will really for sure want to be able to do if you're giving a poster in particular, because people will wander by who actually don't know anything about your field, or they're just there because they're interested in some part of the hallway and they're wandering around just checking things out.
So you've got a lot going for you here with this kind of a scenario. If you're doing a poster presentation, when somebody stops by your poster, at least they've indicated to some degree that they're interested in what's going on, or they want to find out what it's all about. If you're at a holiday gathering away from your scientific colleagues, here you have a great chance to get somebody further interested, more deeply interested in what you're doing, and maybe rope in a couple other people around the table at the same time. So, for example, I came up with something. You might say, well, the thing I'm doing at AGU is going to prepare me for a trip that I will be making in the springtime to Fairbanks, Alaska, where I'm going to work with the Alaska Volcano Observatory and help volcanologists there bear-proof their measuring equipment. Now, I just made that sentence up on purpose to contain a kind of question inside it, just for the fun of it. And if you say, somebody might say to you, what do you mean bear-proof their measuring equipment? What are you measuring, and what is it about bears?
And there aren't any bears in Fairbanks in the AVO.
That's right. And so this really happened to me, and I heard about people who would go up to the Aleutian Islands, which are really remote, and have all kinds of critters on them, including brown bears, which you might say are like grizzlies down in the lower 48. And those kinds of critters can start gnawing at different kinds of equipment that is left out there year-round when people can't get to it. To measure, let's say, the amount of magma that's deforming or reshaping the land underneath. And so that might create more questions on the part of your audience. And any kind of conversation that creates more questions on the part of the audience usually is a good indication to you that you're doing okay. And if you're not so sure about that, you can always ask and say, you following this, or something like that. And the last thing I was going to say about this is you might, in general, load your phone with 4, 5, 6 different pictures of the kind of work you do. Maybe you're doing the work or somebody on your team. It doesn't have to be you all the time, or some place that you go to or will go to. These are a little like the AGU initiative called Postcards from the Field. And so you can show somebody something interesting, and all the burden is not on you to fill up with words this kind of story. The pictures can tell the story. And so that might be a good idea to just think about.
Right, and another way to do this, part of it is they use it as an opportunity to practice something specific like AGU, but alternatively, you can actually just use it as an opportunity to talk about something that really does interest you, that's really fun and you think it's really cool and you're enthusiastic about it, which is a really key point that you want to let your enthusiasms show, your own curiosity, your own excitement, your own perplexity, all of those things that you really feel.
I mean, as a scientist, you're telling some of the greatest stories in the world. You're talking about the essential forces that make our Earth happen and that make life occur. How great is that?
Right. So the next scenario, this is not a separate scenario. This could happen in any of the other ones, and is actually probably fairly likely to happen, and that is that you accidentally start talking too technically. Suddenly you realize you've just said something way too technical. Maybe you just hear it yourself and think, oops, in which case you could just back up and try again. Or maybe you figure this out because you're actually face-to-face with somebody and you watch their eyes glaze over, or you realize their smile has gotten fixed, or their attention is roaming, they're looking at everybody else, or they're pulling out their telephone instead of listening to you.
Right. So what should your response be? It shouldn't be that you should just continue soldiering on, but you might want to pause
Yeah.
and say, oh, did I lose you somewhere? Is there anything I need to back up on? Or something like that. So this is always good practice about watching what your audience is doing.
Right, and while you're at it, I think it's also important not to goof and make it sound like the fault is in the listener. It's not a good idea to make your listener feel stupid. Instead, you want to make your listener feel smart. And so you want to make it clear that, the mistake is yours. You got too technical, not they're undereducated or stupid.
Yeah, you don't want to pound them to death with the knowledge from your world. You want to invite them in to come and share with you the really interesting things that you're doing. And then I have something else on this.
Okay, me too. This is also a good chance to ask for help in helping you understand or see more quickly where you're getting too technical. John and I have found that our own non-specialist category has been really useful for this in our climate change work. We're working with a whole bunch of modelers, so they do computer work, and it's really technical about cloud modeling for climate change. And they would ask us especially to come to practice sessions when they were getting ready to do their annual reports to the NSF review boards. It was a big grant, it lasted a long time. And they would want us to be listening to the technical talk and stop them whenever they got so technical that we couldn't follow it. And this was useful to them because, first of all, we were willing to sound stupid, and we also could easily remember how we didn't know what something meant 3 years before, so we could still flag it even though we had learned. But also their board, even though they're all high-level scientists at the NSF, they were not atmospheric scientists and they were not modelers. So they knew that they needed to talk in much more general terms than they would talk to each other. And you can ask your listener at a social gathering to help you pin down those moments when you go off the rails.
Then there's the question that arises here, which is maybe you don't need to be technical at all, at least not right now. So I've been studying the way people in business who want to sell huge amounts of a product or whatever also do communication, and I've learned a couple interesting things. The most important one, I think, is that when you talk about the benefits of something that you do, rather than the features, you can have a much stronger message going forward. So for example, somebody that's trying to sell you a car and notices that you're there with a family, you have a kid or two and a spouse, instead of going on about the new brake system and how great it is for preventing accidents, and going on about the new design of the chassis of the car, they might say, we can guarantee you, and tests have shown, that this is the safest and quietest car on the road, and this is the best protection that you can possibly have for your family. Now, what does that mean to you as a scientist? It means that if you can somehow talk again about the societal benefit or the benefit to science in general about the work that you're doing, not only that, but if you can make any kind of connection with that, you're much further along to communicating really well.
And you're not going to have to be technical doing it. One other thing to mention right in here, you might all know about the science communication work that Alan Alda has been doing with Stony Brook University in New York. He trains young scientists to do theater improv work. And when you watch him do this, it doesn't look like it has anything at all to do with even communication, never mind science. But it does, because what he's doing is helping people get more and more sensitive to their another person's responses, their body language, their facial expressions. And that is in some ways what you really need to learn to get good at, to avoid this kind of scenario or to stop it in its tracks when you find that you're in that kind of mess.
Okay.
Moving our slide here. Our next scenario, the fifth one.
Let me try.
Shane, it's not moving. Back one. moved too. I didn't wait long enough. No. This one back.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. So this is our least pleasant scenario, but which we would have happily skipped, only we didn't think it would be quite fair to do this. Someone at the dining room table asks you one of those jokey but still slightly hostile questions. For example, we have a neighbor who has more than once met John at the post office and said, "So how's that Al Gore science?" Which is kind of hostile. He's a climate change skeptic, or at least likes to pose as one, and he knows that we work on climate change. So that's hostile, but the tone is always jokey. Or you might be at a table where somebody just blithely announces a bit of pretty clear scientific misinformation. Vaccines lead directly to autism, it's been proven, or 30,000 scientists signed on to a declaration saying that climate change was not real. So how do you cope with that under these kinds of circumstances?
Okay, so not easy. This one can get tricky. First, again, don't blame the person that brings up something like this. Don't get into a fight. Don't take the bait. And at the same time, it's important to not let misinformation or kind of an attitude that doesn't really value evidence-based research, have the day. So you need to do that. So don't get into a fight. Nobody wins if you get into a fight right there. See if you can find some common ground. So let's say you're in Florida, or you're on any of the coasts, not just in the United States, but maybe somewhere else. It might be a chance to talk about some sea level rise, and to go with sea level rise to some area of science that you know a lot about. Maybe there was some flooding, and not simplify things, but find a way to talk about something that clearly the person at the table would know about, impacts on everyday life. Another thing that's good here is that every time you engage somebody, whether or not you so-called win the argument, which is not really the point, you've had the chance to talk to somebody else about how science works. And that's valuable in and of itself, especially in a time when too many of us have seen the way scientific results are sometimes doubted, not because of the power of the science or the amount of the proof, but for other reasons. And so every time you're engaging like this, you're helping somebody understand the great conversation that is science. And so it might be important to say, by the way, this is not just my point of view on this, but I'm one of about 1,000 scientists in my area who have overwhelmingly concluded that such and such is the case.
I also think myself that it's actually okay to just ignore the bait and slide away from the potential conflict. I think it's really important not to get defensive. Not easy not to get defensive, but really important not to be hostile. Maybe make a joke about it. Maybe, as this would fit with what John was saying, say something that's got a slanted relationship to what came up, but is not directly an answer to the misinformation or the hostility. There's lots and lots of evidence that most people can't be converted with just data. But the other thing to think here is that you're in a position to be a scientist talking to a person who may be a little hostile to some kind of science, and you have a chance to be a scientist who is not arrogant, but who is actually a really nice, regular person. And you won't convert somebody to your point of view right on the spot. That's extremely unlikely. But it might be that 3 or 4 months later, the person you've been talking to might be talking to somebody else and find themselves saying, I met this really great young scientist at Thanksgiving who was telling me about this and that, say, with regard to sea level rise. And I hadn't thought about it that way. And, it doesn't fit with other things I know, but, that was a nice person, and I believe that person. So it's a good chance to just be a really good person answering those things. So our final scenario is that you find yourself in a space where people are really trading stories. This doesn't always happen. It never happens, for instance, at my family gatherings. We're not storytellers. But it does happen at John's family gatherings. They trade stories, and it happens at some of the parties that we give and go to. And you want to take the opportunity to tell a story having to do with your science or the science being done by somebody that you know. So say you're not really comfortable. You don't think of yourself as a story person exactly, or you're not used to doing it, but you want to get better at it. So what are some of the things you should think about?
Well, the first thing is to not get uptight about this. It's not like you're facing 100 people that are all suddenly turning their head towards you and you feel the pressure to tell some kind of great story, beginning, middle, end. Mm-hmm. You're not a novelist. You're not a great, you're not Dostoevsky here. You might just be telling the story to a few people. So an anecdote, just part of a story, is really enough. And we've already given some examples of those sorts of things. But here's a couple things to keep in mind. When you tell stories, and when anybody tells stories, that's one of the most basic human ways we have across all cultures to communicate information to each other and to talk about things that we believe in. So it isn't like you're doing a weird thing by telling a story. When you write a job letter, in a sense, you're telling a story about why you're the best person for the particular job in mind. And so you're practicing stories there. You hear them on the radio and so forth. Humans are storytelling animals.
And stories can contain a lot of information. There's sort of ways of embedding and bringing alive information in a form that's easier to listen to and much easier to remember.
Right. So when doctors who are writers or who speak to the public try to communicate, they often use case histories, right? And so they talk about a particular person or a group of people who have had such and such happen to them. So a couple things about stories. One, it doesn't have to be big and long and complicated. Two, you don't have to be the so-called hero of the story. It doesn't have to involve you. It might be about a member of your research team. It might be about somebody that you've heard about that illustrates it. It's good, if possible, to keep people in the stories. It's not always possible, but sometimes if you're going to write about a volcano or earthquake, and it's important maybe to talk about the people who have been affected by it, but not just that. That's the bridge to get to the concept that you're trying to talk about. Well, we all want to hear stories about people. So that's one of the possibilities. It also is a chance to maybe take one of the anecdotes that you've thought about before or that we gave before. So, for example, when I mentioned the bear-proof measuring devices, this might be a chance for me to say a little bit more. When I visited the Alaska Volcano Observatory, one of the guys there that went out to the Aleutian Islands to put this equipment in showed me some pictures he took for his own scrapbook. Again, think about your iPhone, think about postcards from the field. And it showed an antenna that they had set up to transmit, information to satellites. And it's completely bent over like a noodle from the kinds of winds that they have there. And so he told me some stories about how difficult it was to actually be out there. The wind is incredible. It's foggy. It's cold. You have to worry about the bears. And sometimes they have to stay for 3 or 4 days longer than they thought because helicopters can't get in because they can't see a thing.
And John heard
it alive.
Yeah, John heard these stories about 17 years ago and still remembers them and repeats them for other people. Those kinds of stories have a lot of staying power.
And it underscores the kind of thing that's in some of these stories, which is that oftentimes we go on a journey. And as researchers, we're always going on a journey, whether it's in the lab, and you can talk about what kind of thing you're looking at in the lab, what kind of machine you're using, or a real place. A specific time. Last summer, we went to Antarctica, that kind of thing. And so people can put themselves in your place or in the place of the person you're talking to. And that's a great way. And to have fun talking about these crazy things that we do because we're passionate about science.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the things we would both come back to on the question of stories is to reiterate that they don't have to be a giant big deal, that we tend to tell them anyway with our friends. You might tend to tell them anyway at a holiday gathering, and it's a really good chance to get to feeling more comfortable about thinking of yourself as a person who tells stories. we've been in places where we've been hearing young scientists give little 2 or 3 minute presentations about what they do, and they'll be fine, but we sort of forget them because there's too many of them, and it all blends together. And then over dinner, later on, somebody will start saying, oh, well, so I was in Mongolia, riding in this Jeep caravan to get to the trees where I was going to do tree rings, and suddenly that person's work becomes much more alive, and there was kind of nothing to her saying that, but we were able to get her to speak longer about it, and that made it really good.
And then the last thing I want to add on that is for practice in storytelling, if you try your hand at a blog is like a kind of a rough draft. It's like trying to do a research paper with the pressure off, and it's like a short version of that. And to try writing a little anecdote or story inside a blog isn't bad practice for this kind of thing.
And vice versa. Talking to your next door neighbor is good practice for writing a blog. Sorry I didn't get this slide up on time, but that's what we were just talking about. And our final sort of summary point is that really this does boil down, I think, in many ways, to talk as a person to real people. Be your full-fledged self with your enthusiasm and let that enthusiasm show. But also keep in mind that you may know what matters and not have to talk about it most of the time because you're in the weeds, but it's always a really good idea to keep your eye on what matters in general, what matters to you, what might matter to your listeners, what matters to the world, and do that as a human being talking to other human beings.
Yeah, you're not a walking, talking dissertation.
Right.
You're a walking, talking human being who has interesting things to say.
And at the holidays, it's a human being that you're talking as and you're talking to. So we have one slide left, if I can get it up there, that just collects these 3 scenarios, and we thought we would,
6 scenarios.
6 scenarios, get Shane to leave this up until he needs to do his AGU talks while we see if there have been any questions. So over to you, Shane.
Great. Thank you, SueEllen and John, and thanks everyone for sticking around while we have some technical issues. We got through it. That was really great. So yes, if anyone has any questions, you'll see on the little panel widget on your right, there's a box that says questions. You can type them in there, and then we'll get to answering some of those. Until then, I actually have a question or two for the both of you. I know that there's a structure oftentimes associated with storytelling, kind of this story arc. Would you suggest that folks just kind of, if they are new to storytelling, would you suggest that they just kind of get comfortable with telling a story, just kind of get out there and just start doing it because we do it naturally, or really kind of focus more on getting down the formula first before they get it out there? I guess my question is, like, how refined should stories be before telling them?
That's a good question, Shane.
Yeah, it's a great question.
I think one response I'd have is that, we all learn differently, and we all have different skills. And sometimes it helps if you see a kind of like a graph or, some kind of data, you might say. And a lot of people learn best by looking at those things first. Others hear anecdotes, and they learn through those. So if you're one of the people that likes to sort of see the data, in visual form, you might consider the kind of arc of a story. So if you have an x-axis there, that's your lateral one, you could say, well, that's time. This happens, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And then your y-axis, your vertical one, is, you might say, rising tension or interest. Well, we went to the Antarctic, and we were on an icebreaker that hadn't been really broken in before. And we ran into some ice that was a bit thicker than we were expecting. And things started slowing down.
And then the engine broke.
Yeah. And so what you're doing is the tension is rising as you're moving through event after event. And you can mark that out as a sort of rising tension. And at the top of the graph is usually the climax, or the moment when you break out of the ice finally, or you figure out the answer to the problem, or at least you figure out how to move forward. And that can be, that can be really helpful to see that. So this basically shows that a story is about a person, usually about a person or a living thing that is faced by a challenge and finds a way to overcome the challenge, or at least finds a way to start figuring it out.
There's a very funny video on YouTube that's really easy to find by the novelist Kurt Vonnegut, V-O-N-N-E-G-U-T, Vonnegut, called something like Storytelling or Plots or something like that. It's really easy to show up, and he makes a joke out of it. He draws the story arc picture on a little graph for a lot of different familiar stories like Cinderella. If you would find that kind of thing useful, I really recommend that video. But I also think, Shane, your other option is fine for a lot of people. Just start telling them and watch your audience's reaction and see if it seems to be working, or listen to the kinds of questions that they ask and see if you can anticipate those questions the next time you tell the story.
Yeah, and go with your own passions.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, both. Yeah, it just basically seems that practice makes perfect, and if you don't get out there and start telling stories, then you'll never quite know whether or not you're good at it or whether or not you enjoy it.
Right.
We got a question, are there any storytelling courses that you can recommend?
You might look on the website of the Stony Brook Center for Science Communication, or just look under Alan Alda, ALDA/science. All kinds of stuff will come up there. There's a website, what is Ben Lilly? There's a website called Story Collider, in which scientists work on slightly longer stories, and you can see examples of that. And then for a little bit more basic, but it's really good, you might look at 3MT Winners. Just Google that up, and that's a 3-minute thesis. And that's, competitions all over the country, all over the world. Started in Queensland, Australia. And you get good examples of usually postdoc types or finishing up grad students who have 3 minutes and one slide, one image, to talk about what they do and why it matters. And they're talking to a general audience across the university, not just in their area. Those can be really illuminating. Some of that is, you might say, your elevator speech, but a lot of it involves storytelling, and there are tons of them online.
Yeah, and a lot of the winners of those actually frame their little 3 minutes around a story, or they start with one. So they're not courses, but they're useful models to follow. In a way, that's a really interesting question, because I think the answer may generally be no, there aren't very many courses about storytelling at this kind of level. There's courses you can take if you want to become a professional storyteller, but that's really different. And I think it's because for the fields where stories really win, like in English departments, that's kind of information we feel that we were born knowing, even though, of course, we weren't born knowing it, but we picked it up early on because it was just basic, sort of like biologists really don't need to be taught about why carbon is important, because they just already know why carbon is important. You have to pick it up around here and there.
Great. Yeah, and I will say we did get some messages from some participants with some great suggestions from books, and Second City and The Great Courses has a course. So just to let everyone know, we'll be sending out a link when the archived version of this webinar is available, probably early next week, and we'll send out some of the suggestions that we've received as well, so that y'all can see it. And I will say, John brought this up, and this is a shameless plug, but in addition to being at AGU, I am actually involved with Story Collider, and so there's a podcast, there's some good examples, and just the Moth is just a general storytelling organization all around the world, and they have podcasts with 6-7-minute stories. And so if you just want some examples, those are some great places that I think, some great places to start. Another question, yeah, of course. Another question, this is maybe not specific to the folks here per se, but everyone on the webinar is obviously interested in this type of thing, but do you have any suggestions for how we as scientists or science-interested folks can go out and convince others of the value of storytelling and using storytelling in their messaging?
Well, I would just say everybody should just talk about it when they have opportunities to talk about anything, rather than, worry about formal possibilities or formal opportunities. Though sometimes those could come up. You could offer to colleagues to run a little workshop where everybody would try out storytelling, for example. But no, other than that, John?
Well, I wonder if some folks that are on here today have ever taken part or attended any of the science cafes that so many towns have, university towns usually put on. Those are fun and entertaining events to take part in. I suppose you could create something with your own department that sort of reaches out across disciplines. You might start with disciplines close to the ones that you're in, and then try to reach out a little bit farther. That's another possibility.
A lot of the work being done these days on storytelling for scientists is being done by scientists. And so there will be many conferences now, like AGU, will have sessions that are maybe not directly about that, but are kind of about that, and you could not just go to those, but talk to the people there, see if they've got ideas, propose something for next year's, to give a talk yourself about storytelling or a poster. Those kinds of topics are welcome, I think, in most scientific circles these days.
Yeah. You could also maybe connect with graduate students who are friends of yours or just acquaintances that are in other departments and have a couple of get-togethers and just practice this stuff with each other.
Yeah.
I had the occasion, I wrote 3 or 4 plain-spoken scientist blogs for AGU. They're still up there a couple of years ago. And one of them, there was a scientist here in town, and he told me that he went to Toastmasters. I don't know if some of you have heard about that. I used to think it was like for, insurance salesmen to sort of just, in a goofy way make smart comments to, get more customers. But in fact, it's really great practice, learning how to talk to people and overcome shyness and so forth. And our town has a regular Toastmasters group. MIT has 5 different Toastmasters groups that work in and out of the university. And so obviously a lot of people think that there's a lot to be learned there.
Great. Thank you both. So that seems to be kind of what we have. Oh, wait. Hold on. There's one more.
Okay. The timing is perfect.
I know. It's perfect. We can go back. Hold on. We have, how can we tell stories about issues where our listeners might start to feel guilty? For example, friends who buy fish species threatened by overfishing, or flooring with exotic hardwoods. So yeah, that type of thing. How can we kind of not be the, let's say, doom and gloom scientists that some of us, will certainly take ownership of this, can be?
Yeah, this brings up some really interesting questions. The doom and gloom thing, first of all, I've even made this mistake by too quickly telling one of my English classes about things I knew about climate change, and I realized when I looked up that I had lost half the class. They were checking their phones, and they never do that in my classes, it seems like.
Yeah, too depressing.
It was too depressing, too fast, and I didn't offer any hope for anything. So, of course, that's something to keep in mind. Yeah, some of these things are doomy and gloomy,
and
but that doesn't mean, and guilt-inducing, but that doesn't mean that has to be the main focus. So guilt-inducing, there's ways to say, until I learned a lot about this one thing, I used to do the same exact thing.
Yeah.
Or my brother still does this.
Yeah. Or that is absolutely gorgeous flooring. Do you happen to know where it comes from and how it's cut? Is it sustainable or not? And or this fish. I love this fish, but I recently learned that it's being overfished, and we probably shouldn't do it. And it's been really hard for me to back off. But I've kind of been doing it. So to put yourself in the position where you're not being holier than thou so much as you're being somebody who maybe knows a little bit more and has been trying to do a little bit better, that might help.
Yeah, or maybe to bring everybody in and say, yeah, I can see that's a problem, but we don't have too many choices on what we buy, let's say. I wonder if we can think about what would be better, and maybe we can find more information on that. But in other words, it's not like me good, you bad.
Right, and you really do have to avoid that, because you're right, that's a bad idea. And I think anybody who's really paying attention and trying to do things runs into that scenario fairly often, and it's not an easy one. It's kind of like dealing with the hostility. Only in this case, you are likely to be the hostile person, which you don't want to be.
Great, thanks both. All right, so that's just about time for today. Just some wrap-up things. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are the Sharing Science program within the American Geophysical Union. Our goal is to provide scientists with the skills and tools that they need to communicate their message to any audience. So you can find us online, Twitter. If you're interested in this type of stuff, join the network. And also, if you're going to be at our fall meeting in New Orleans this year, we're going to have an entire week of programming. So we'll send a bunch of this stuff out in the email that will come out next week. But I just wanted to thank SueEllen and John for their great presentation today, and thank all of you for tuning in. So thank you both, and yeah, we'll send out the email next week.
Thank you all, and happy holidays.
Yeah, same here. Thanks. It was really fun.
Thanks all.